Morning over Lake Victoria doesn't begin with the roar of engines or the bark of megaphones. It begins with a silence that feels innocent, almost sleepy, as if Africa, for one brief moment, has forgotten the world that has spent decades trying to rearrange it, remodel it, fix it, reform it, and extract value from it. Mist hangs low over the water. Fishing boats drift like shadows. The sun rises without urgency, unaware that beneath its light, one of the most consequential contests of the 21st century has been unfolding, a contest with no rifle fire, no armed drones, no trenches, and yet with stakes that reach far beyond any single border, control over the future of entire regions. Uganda wakes the way it always does. Vendors unfold their stalls. Boda motorcycles flood Kampala's streets. Children walk to school. Civil servants open their offices. Politicians rehearse yet another speech about development and stability. At first glance, nothing changes. But beneath the everyday rhythm, beneath the road dust and exhaust fumes, another system is at work, slower, quieter, and far more patient. It is a system of contracts and memoranda, credit lines and repayment schedules. It does not need flags on masts or soldiers at borders, because its strength is not violence. Its strength is structure. When planes from Beijing touch down at Entebbe, no generals in dress uniforms step onto the tarmac. Instead, it is managers, engineers, bankers, and diplomats who arrive. People in suits rather than fatigues, carrying briefcases rather than rifles. Their conversations rarely make front pages because they are not dramatic enough. There are no words about war, occupation, or revolution. There are numbers instead: interest rates, construction timelines, delivery milestones, and clauses written in small print that almost nobody reads carefully except lawyers. In this world, it is the small print that changes the course of history. For decades, Uganda, a landlocked country, was treated as a peripheral space in the global economy. Too far from major seaports, too poorly connected, too poor to attract the attention of large investors. Yet under the new logic of global competition, geographic peripheries increasingly become strategic nodes. As the world began to fracture under the pressure of trade wars, sanctions, and fragile supply chains, East Africa stopped looking like a forgotten region and started looking like a corridor, an emerging passage through which future commerce could move. China understood that faster than most. While Western institutions debated standards, human rights frameworks, and procedural safeguards, Beijing operated with a simpler calculus. If a country needs roads, you build roads. If it needs airports, you expand airports. If it lacks capital, you provide capital, on your terms. This is not philanthropy. It is the architecture of influence, built not in a year or a single government term, but in layers, kilometer by kilometer, contract by contract, corridor by corridor. The Kampala-Entebbe Expressway, the new artery linking the capital to the airport, became a symbol of that shift. For residents, it is simply a faster route. For politicians, it is proof of progress. For Beijing, it is one tile in a larger mosaic, because infrastructure is never neutral when it locks in technical standards, financial obligations, and logistical dependencies. Whoever builds the road often supplies the traffic management systems. Whoever modernizes the airport sets safety protocols and operational standards. Whoever finances the project gains leverage over its future. This is how a new kind of empire forms. An empire without one capital, one emperor, or one flag. It is a networked empire built on connections, nodes, and flows. You will not see it on political maps, but you can trace it clearly on logistics maps. Inside Uganda's development ministries, plans for the next wave of investment now hang on walls. New rail lines, inland port upgrades, expanded energy networks, and projects tied to oil extraction. Each one is framed in the language of modernization and advancement. Each has an economic rationale on its own, but taken together, they become something larger than the sum of individual projects. They form a new architecture of dependency, in which local sovereignty is slowly translated into technological and financial interdependence. And it is here, by Lake Victoria, beneath palm shadows and the glass facades of modern Kampala, that two worlds meet. One is in Africa trying to recover decades of lost development. The other is a China attempting to build global position not through military conquest, but through control of the movement of goods, energy, and capital. This documentary is not the story of one project or one agreement. It is the story of how power is being redefined in the 21st century. It is about roads becoming instruments of policy and loans becoming a form of pressure. It is about countries that only recently depended on humanitarian aid turning into arenas of geopolitical competition between new empires. And it is also a story about silence. The silence that settles when decisions are made behind closed doors. The silence that covers long-term consequences with short-term victories. The silence that hovers over the lake at dawn while somewhere far away in air-conditioned conference rooms, someone signs a document that will shape the lives of millions. Because real empires do not begin with a gunshot, they begin with a signature. As the sun climbs higher over Kampala, the city begins to pulse faster, like a body shifting from sleep into work. Streets thicken with traffic. Horns build a constant cacophony. Office towers fill with people who move through the same daily routines, often unaware that their ordinary lives are becoming more tightly bound to decisions made thousands of kilometers away. In the newer districts, where hotels rise, conference centers open, and international firms plant their flags, development looks like the fulfillment of a promise Africa has heard for decades. Roads are wider. Lights are brighter. Billboards are louder. The language of business sounds more global. But beneath that glossy layer, a different mechanism begins to operate. Far less cinematic, far more durable. The machinery of infrastructure debt does not resemble a household loan or a typical commercial credit line. It is a system of interconnected agreements, sovereign guarantees, project collateral, procurement conditions, and execution clauses that together create a closed circuit of money, technology, and influence. When Uganda takes a loan to build a highway, the funds rarely flow into Ugandan industry. They typically cycle back to Chinese contractors, Chinese equipment manufacturers, and Chinese technology suppliers. In practical terms, the debt remains in Africa, while a significant share of the profit returns to Asia. For Kampala's political class, the model seemed ideal for a long time. It allowed leaders to offer voters something concrete, ribbons cut, roads opened, new projects launched, without immediately raising taxes or slashing social spending. Development became political merchandise, sold at rallies and polished in press briefings. Every new road was proof that the government could deliver. Every new power plant was a symbol of progress. Every upgraded airport was a preview of a future in which Uganda would no longer be a periphery. The problem was that this future was increasingly being written into contracts most citizens would never read and would not fully understand even if they did. Inside ministerial offices, negotiations unfolded that rarely entered public view. Grace periods, interest rates, repayment calendars, asset security provisions. Each side spoke the language of pragmatism. Uganda needed infrastructure. China offered capital and know-how. Yet the exchange was shaped by an asymmetry that grew more visible over time. On one side stood a developing state with limited legal and negotiating capacity. On the other stood a global financial state machine, experienced in deploying similar frameworks across Asia, Latin America, and the wider African continent. When the first reports surfaced about clauses connected to Entebbe Airport, unease spread into public space. Media began asking whether critical infrastructure could serve as collateral for sovereign loans. Politicians moved quickly to calm the public, insisting no takeover scenario existed, that the state retained full control, that the debt trap narrative was exaggerated. Yet the very need for such assurances revealed that the issue was no longer merely technical, it had become political. For ordinary residents of Kampala, the debate still felt distant. What mattered was that travel to the airport was faster, congestion lighter, the city's surface more modern. But away from the capital's core, development looked very different. In neighborhoods and communities where clean water, stable electricity, and quality education remained scarce, billion-dollar megaprojects could feel like a luxury disconnected from daily realities. The contrast between polished billboards and lived conditions became harder to ignore. At the same time, Uganda was being analyzed in Beijing not as a country in isolation, but as a piece of a regional puzzle. East Africa began to be imagined as a future trade corridor linking the continent's interior to the Indian Ocean's ports. Rail lines, roads, and logistics hubs would form a network enabling smooth flows of resources, goods, and energy. Even without direct sea access, Uganda sat inside this vision as a transit point and resource hinterland, an inland hinge in a broader machine. This is the moment the relationship stopped looking like ordinary investment cooperation and started resembling a long-range geopolitical project. Infrastructure was no longer simply a tool of development, it became an instrument of influence. Each agreement increased technological compatibility, tied maintenance and servicing to external suppliers, and built a dependency network that would be expensive to break without destabilizing the system itself. The West watched with growing concern, but reacted slowly and inconsistently. European programs were burdened with procedures, transparency requirements, and political conditionality that many African governments found difficult to accept. Against that, China's offer looked faster, simpler, more tangible. In a world increasingly governed by speed, that advantage often proved decisive. Uganda thus drifted into a position where its development trajectory became linked to one dominant partner. Formal sovereignty was not lost, but the space for maneuver began to change. The more projects were built within one financing and execution model, the harder it became to pivot abruptly without triggering systemic disruption. Over Lake Victoria, the sun rose high, and the day continued in its familiar rhythm. Fishermen returned with their catch, children finished their lessons, civil servants closed folders and locked office doors. On the surface, everything looked normal. Beneath that normality, however, a network of dependencies was forming, one that would determine who writes the rules of the game in East Africa's future. Because this story is not only about Uganda, it is about a model of the world in which empires do not need colonies. They can achieve similar outcomes through loans, contracts, and infrastructure. It is about the moment global competition moved from battlefields into conference rooms, where the fate of regions is negotiated across tables rather than fought across fronts. That is why the lake's silence is so deceptive. While the water mirrors a calm sky, a deeper process is underway beneath the surface of politics and economics, one that, in the long run, will reshape power not only in Uganda but across the continent. Over time, the silence began to crack. At first, it was tentative. Questions raised in universities, voiced in radio debates, whispered in Kampala cafes. Then it grew louder as the numbers began to enter public awareness. Public debt rose faster than official forecasts predicted. Debt servicing costs consumed an expanding share of the national budget. Development stopped being an abstract future and became a burden on the present. Inside finance ministries, a different kind of pressure emerged, one unrelated to televised press events. Officials began calculating not only repayment installments, but the political consequences of decisions made years earlier. Every signature placed under an infrastructure agreement returned now as a payment schedule indifferent to election cycles and shifting public moods. Debt does not recognize political popularity. It obeys mathematics, not emotion. In Kampala's streets, early protests began to appear, fragmented at first, without a single banner or unified slogan. People came out because prices were rising, jobs were scarce, and the development celebrated on television did not match their daily reality. Signs did not mention bank names or foreign creditors, yet the atmosphere of frustration created space for a deeper question to surface. whether the economic strategy itself still made sense. At the same time, foreign media began to pay attention to Uganda not as an exotic East African state, but as a case study in a new global model. Articles examined contract structures, debt profiles, and the role of Chinese financial institutions. The phrase debt trap began circulating, provoking both defensive and aggressive responses. Uganda's government dismissed the accusation as Western propaganda, an attempt by former influence holders to reclaim narrative control over a continent they were losing. China, for its part, responded in the language of pragmatism and partnership. It emphasized that it invests where others only promise, that it builds infrastructure Africa needs, and that it does not impose political conditions. In Beijing's narrative, China positioned itself as an alternative to a world dominated by Western financial institutions that for decades dictated reform terms and privatization agendas. For many African elites, that vision was attractive because it seemed to offer autonomy, even if, in practice, it often meant exchanging one kind of dependence for another. Uganda thus found itself between two competing narratives fighting to interpret the same reality. One spoke of a new South-South partnership, a multipolar world, and the end of Western dominance. The other warned of rising debt, weakening control over strategic infrastructure, and the long-term consequences of short-term gains. The truth, as usual, refused to fit inside slogans. It lived somewhere between them, hidden in contractual details and in the lived experiences of ordinary people. Outside the capital, the changes were less spectacular but no less consequential. Where new roads appeared, land values surged. Communities were pushed away from zones designated for investment. Farmers lost access to fields, and compensation did not always match the real cost of displacement. Infrastructure that, in theory, was meant to connect regions and create opportunity, often produced relocation pressures and land conflicts in practice. The state tried to contain the tension through the language of stability and security. Control over public space tightened. State media increasingly leaned into narratives about foreign plots and hostile interests allegedly seeking to destabilize the country. In that climate, criticism of infrastructure projects was framed as opposition to the national interest, further complicating honest public debate. Meanwhile, in global financial centers, Uganda began to be treated as part of a larger trend affecting many developing states. Investors assessed credit risk. Rating agencies issued reports. Analysts built models predicting how long the infrastructure debt financing system could remain stable. Each shift in the global economy, each rise in interest rates, each commodity shock, each inflation spike directly affected a country like Uganda's ability to service obligations. This was the moment the story stopped being local. Uganda became a fragment of a global puzzle in which decisions made in Washington, Beijing, and Brussels had direct consequences for life along Lake Victoria. Geopolitical competition stopped sounding like textbook abstraction and began appearing in fuel prices, currency fluctuations, and the availability of basic public services. In the evening, as the sun slipped behind the horizon, Kampala sank into orange light that briefly made the city look calm, almost harmonious. The image was deceptive. Beneath everyday routines, tension grew between the promise of development and the real costs of transformation. There was no single flashpoint, no singular explosion. The pressure accumulated slowly, layer by layer, much like the infrastructure that had helped produce it. And in that slow accumulation lies the danger. World-shaping processes rarely announce themselves with spectacle. They arrive with the quiet rustle of documents being signed, the release of another loan tranche, the opening of yet another construction site. By the time people realize the rules have been rewritten, it is often too late to return to the starting point. The true test arrived when the world briefly stopped operating by familiar rules. Global economic shocks, supply chain disruptions, rising commodity prices, and inflation placed developing states under double pressure. They had to maintain the investment momentum promised to their societies, while simultaneously facing rising debt service costs that ceased to be abstract figures in a budget and became immediate, painful constraints. In Uganda, the effects were felt quickly. Higher fuel prices struck transportation, more expensive energy raised production costs. A weaker currency made repayment of foreign currency debt even heavier. Each month brought new tension and forced the government into increasingly difficult decisions. Spending cuts triggered public anger. Attempts to increase revenues met resistance from business and an emerging middle class. This was the moment the relationship with China entered a new phase. Beijing, long portrayed as the stable development partner, began enforcing contractual terms more firmly. Debt restructuring talks grew tougher, shaped by creditor protections and a sharper defense of financial interests. Publicly, the language remained polite, emphasizing flexibility and mutual understanding. Privately, negotiations increasingly resembled cold calculations focused on safeguards, timelines, and guarantees. For Uganda, this created a narrowing corridor of choice. Delays in repayment could damage creditworthiness and frighten investors. Aggressive austerity could ignite social unrest and internal instability. The state's room for maneuver began to shrink dramatically, squeezed between fiscal mathematics and political reality. Internationally, Uganda became a symbol of a broader challenge confronting many developing countries. Infrastructure financing models that once looked effective began revealing weaknesses under global turbulence. A larger question emerged. Had the world built a system that works in stable times but fractures under the first serious crisis? China did not withdraw from Africa in response. Instead, it adjusted. The era of headline megaprojects began to give way to smaller, more selective investments concentrated in sectors central to long-term strategic interests. In practice, that meant heavier focus on energy, raw materials, and logistics, areas whose value remained strategic regardless of business cycles. For Uganda, this shift signaled that the period of easy capital was ending. Projects that once moved forward almost automatically began requiring additional guarantees and more complex negotiations. The government had to choose more carefully which investments were truly essential and which had served primarily as political marketing. Then, another complication entered the picture. The West, alarmed by China's expanding influence, began pushing harder to re-engage East Africa. New investment programs, infrastructure initiatives, and partnership pledges appeared. But for Uganda, these offers arrived after much of the strategic space had already been occupied by existing contracts and obligations. The country was forced to balance competing blocs while trying not to become a proxy arena for great power rivalry. At night, lights in Kampala's new business districts flickered on, while police drones patrolled major arteries. The image of modernity stood in sharp contrast to the uncertainty increasingly heard in everyday conversations. Questions about children's futures, job stability, and the meaning of development promises began displacing earlier enthusiasm. At this point, Uganda's story stopped being the story of one country. It became a warning and a preview at once. A warning about a world where debt-financed development can quickly become a burden, and a preview of an era in which global power will rely increasingly on control over infrastructure, finance, and technology rather than traditional military force. Over Lake Victoria, night fell quietly, as it always does. The water reflected the city's lights. Wind traced small waves across the surface, waves that vanished as quickly as they formed. The calm, however, was only apparent because beneath it lay a story still expanding toward its full scale. Because the introduction to Uganda's relationship with China is now ending, and the real story begins with the central question of this podcast. Did Uganda build its future, or did it merely lease it on credit?